Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode, I have on Tunde and Musa from the Black Alliance for Peace, the Atlanta chapter, to talk about GILEE, the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, which is a program that the U.S. runs in this context through the Georgia State University Foundation and these other funding sources by which domestic police forces can link up with and train with foreign forces, specifically the Israeli occupying forces, to train, how police tactics, suppression tactics, etc. We talk about Cop City and its connection to GILEE. We talk about the 1033 program, which is a program by which military gear can get funneled down for very, very cheap to local police departments, militarizing those police departments in the process. We talk about society as a whole, the protest movements in the past, the position that the ruling class is coming from, and what their intentions are with such programs, and what they think the future is, what we think the future is, what the Black Alliance for Peace and other organizations are doing on the ground to counter these attempts to basically implement, Cop City, implement these various fascist formations, etc. So this is a really important episode that I think ties a lot of things that you hear. You hear stuff like, militarized police equipment, and you hear stuff like, there's Cop Cities being built, and you hear, the U.S. works with Israel to train their forces, and sometimes those things can seem like disparate strands of political intrigue, but they are all deeply connected, and we make that very clear through this episode. Couldn't ask for two better guests on to do just that. So that's what we're going to be covering today. And for those that don't know, we have a wonderful collaboration with the comrades over at leftwingbooks.net and Kerspledladeb, who are offering Rev Left listeners 15% off any book in their ever-growing library. They have wonderful, wonderful texts of theory, of proletarian and anti-colonial history, anti-imperialism, and I'm just scrolling the front page of their book section just to pull out some books that people might be interested in. I see The Communist Necessity by J. Malfawad Paul. Highly recommend. We've done an episode, many episodes of JMP. We've done an episode on that book in particular. Really good stuff. The Red Army Factions, The Urban Guerrilla Concept, looks dope. 500 Years of Indigenous Resistance comic book by Gord Hill. We have The Essential Works of Lenin, On the Vanguard by Kevin Rashid Johnson, who we interviewed from prison on this show. Essays from the Minister of Defense from the Black Panther Party. Of course, Continuity and Rupture. All of JMP's works, I believe, are on this. The Black Panthers Speak. Collect the works of the Black Liberation Army. Ireland, Colonialism and the Unfinished Revolution. The Marx and Engels on colonies, industrial monopoly, and the working class movement. And I could go on all day. There's 130 pages to tab through of books that people can check out and get a discount just for being a Rev Left listener. So it's a really cool opportunity. We're really happy to collaborate with the good folks over there, and I highly recommend you check them out. But without further ado, here's my conversation with Musa and Tunde from the Black Alliance for Peace Atlanta chapter on GILEE, Cop City, the 1033 program, and so much more. Enjoy.
My name is Tunde Osazuwa. I'm a member of the Black Alliance for Peace Atlanta Citywide Alliance, and also with the Demilitarized Atlanta to Palestine Coalition, and just happy to be here.
Hey y'all, I'm Musa, host of the Groundings podcast, also a member of the Black Alliance for Peace in Atlanta. Also happen to be the international youth representative for the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente, cultural worker, organizer here in the South, and always happy to be invited to Rev Left. And thanks for having us.
Absolutely. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you both back on. You've both been on multiple episodes, I believe. Walter Rodney episode, Kwame Nkrumah episode, African episodes, etc. So I know you've both been on individually, never together. It's an honor to have you back on. And of course, I love everything that the Black Alliance for Peace does, and I always am excited to give that organization airtime here on Rev Left. But today we're going to be talking about the GILEE program. So for those who don't know, what exactly is the GILEE program, and who, importantly, is Robert Friedman?
Yeah, so I will start us off. So GILEE stands for the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, and it's a prominent deadly exchange program based here in Atlanta at the Georgia State University campus. They have an office on the sixth floor of the Andrew Young, I guess, Institute of Policy Studies building, and it's kind of part of that program. It's kind of it's built as like a research institution, but really it's a deadly exchange program. So there are multiple instances of deadly exchange programs throughout the country, right? A lot of them are facilitated by I guess Zionist formations, but this one, right, is through the university, and all of these programs, they bring together, U.S. law enforcement, so U.S. police, ICE agents, FBI, Homeland Security, all sorts of law enforcement, and bring them together with their counterparts in Israel. So the Israeli National Police, the Israeli occupation forces in general, right? And they work to exchange really what we would call the worst practices to promote the colonial occupation of working class and poor communities here in the U.S. and they're really occupied by the police here, right? Like you could call the police like something like occupying armies. And so I think these deadly exchange programs, they are used to maintain the settler colonial state, right? Like the settler colonial nature of this society. And so with GILEE, right, it's pretty prominent. Over 1,500 U.S. law enforcement officials across the country have participated in exchanges. It's something like 46,000. Yeah, I think 46 or 43,000 public safety, Homeland Security, and police leadership, executives have attended GILEE-led briefings, seminars, workshops, training sessions and conferences just to discuss issues of Homeland Security, right? Public safety, law enforcement in general. And so the point of the the program was founded in 1992 by a Georgia State University professor, Robert Friedman, who he now serves as the founding director. I think his area of expertise, I believe he was a physics professor, but he's written a lot about what they call counterterrorism. And maybe Musa can speak more to who Robert Friedman is, but he's made all sorts of I guess anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, Islamophobic statements, right? That kind of reflect a racist ideology. But yeah, I'll pass it to Musa to continue.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tunde. So yeah, as you said, GILEE is the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange Program. And I think one thing that's really important for listeners to understand is that GILEE is just one of these programs that is primarily located in Georgia, but all across the nation, there are several of these programs that do exactly what GILEE does. So they facilitate training and exchange of ideas and cooperation between local pigs and Zionist pigs. This could be in the form of them quite literally bringing dozens of U.S. pigs over to occupied Palestine and have them train directly with Zionist occupation forces, or they come over here into our neighborhoods to train the pigs who oppress us. And so it's essentially oppressors swapping notes. And the GILEE program, like Tunde said, was started by Robert Friedman in 1992. Robert Friedman is a sociologist and criminologist who is heavily, heavily invested in Zionism and the project of Israel throughout his entire career. And working at Georgia State University in the heart of Atlanta, people need to understand the context of when this program started in 1992 was when there was talk of Atlanta hosting the Olympics. the Olympics was an extremely watershed moment for the city because some of the things that took place were hundreds of Black homeless people being put on one-way buses out of the city, being lied to and told that they were going to be receiving a bed and a warm meal and jobs where they were going. New law enforcement agencies were actually created in Atlanta, municipal agencies. And then, of course, there is this massive, quote-unquote, counterterrorism and surveillance and militarization push underneath all of it. And so part of this was criminalizing the poor, criminalizing working-class people, under the guise of claiming that they were doing, quote-unquote, counterterrorism because the Olympics made our city allegedly vulnerable to so-called terrorism. So this is where GILEE comes from. GILEE arises out of this sentiment of criminalizing homeless people, criminalizing Black people, heightened surveillance. This is also around the time when the foundations are started to be laid for the Operation Shield, early version of that across Atlanta, which is a network of tens of thousands of security cameras across the city and other forms of surveillance. And so this program is actually housed at Georgia State, like Tunde said, in the Institute of Policy Studies, but it's basically sponsored and fully funded through groups like the Atlanta Police Foundation and the Georgia State Foundation. And so these are nonprofit private entities that allows major corporations to funnel money into this GILEE program, essentially. So I'm going to stop there because there's so much we could say, but, this is essentially police from the U.S., an occupying force of Black and oppressed people already, going and trading notes with how to best occupy and police and dominate the people who are currently committing genocide. Right? The people who are oppressing Palestinians and who are live streaming a genocide right now, the local police officers patrolling your neighborhood is learning from them. So, that is really what's at the heart of all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the features here that has been spoken, to already by both of you, but just to sort of put a fine point on it, is that this GILEE program represents the sort of international solidarity between imperialist forces, but even more specifically settler colonial entities who have similar issues, right? You have a native population, indigenous peoples, oppressed nationalities within your borders that need to be controlled, that are by their very nature impoverished and ghettoized and set aside from mainstream culture. They're preyed upon by the state. They're policed very heavily. And so, Israel being the sort of quintessential settler colonial entity in the 21st century, just like all of its 18th, 17th century brutalities and absurdities and intrinsic racisms are just given full-throated support and articulation by Israel. And so, of course, it would make sense that these two entities work together. And, of course, Israel and the United States were two of the very last countries on earth to finally accept the dissolution of apartheid South Africa. They rode for South Africa up until the very, very end when it was literally impossible to continue doing so. And of course, supplied and supported and funded and armed and backed politically and gave cover to apartheid South Africa. So these connections are very important. And of course, everybody on this call understands the utter essential nature of international solidarity for colonized people and for oppressed people and for the proletariat globally, because our enemies are very international in their structures as well. So we have to at least match that, right? Well, let's go ahead and move on to this next question. I'm going to skip a couple questions ahead and just talk about funding, because Musa, you were already going into that, so I figure we can kind of flesh that out a little bit more. You talked about some of the organizations behind it, and you mentioned that there was corporate funding for these programs. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the corporations who are funding this program, and why it would be in the interests of these seemingly disparate corporations to fund a program like this?
Yeah, well, and I think, something you said a second ago, too, that needs to be named is that there is a massive Zionist propaganda campaign there has been for at least 75 years now, but especially in the last 20 years, of claiming that the illegitimate occupying apartheid genocidal Israeli state is quote unquote the most advanced military in the world, right? And this is all predicated on them slaughtering Palestinians. And also it's just simply not true. They're getting slaughtered on the battlefield by guerrillas at this moment. And so programs like GILEE also operate to legitimate the propaganda that Israel is some miraculously advanced revolutionary fighting force when it's just simply not true at all. So I did just want to add that point on too as well.
Yeah.
And there have been so the thing is, GILEE, one of the ways that GILEE operates is through secrecy and very shadowy dealings. In many ways, it is sort of collusion between private and public interests, because everything is funneled through donations to these nonprofit entities that then distribute the money or funnel the money through the university department and or directly into the program. And so we've been seeing this with Cop City, for example. It would be journalistic malpractice to a certain extent for me to claim that Home Depot is directly giving money to Cop City. However, they're giving tens of millions of dollars to the Atlanta Police Foundation, which sponsors and is actually operating Cop City, right? And so in that regard, GILEE operates the same way. There's a nonprofit, it's slipping my mind, but maybe Tunde can help me, at Georgia State. I believe it's the Georgia State Foundation, if I'm not mistaken. But, they're essentially the largest fundraiser for GILEE. The other one is the Atlanta Police Foundation. So between these two organizations, we have, tax records of donations from groups like local groups, especially that have a big, who control essentially and dominate local economy in Atlanta, like Delta, Home Depot, Coca-Cola, Starbucks, Norfolk Southern, which was recently responsible for a massive ecological catastrophe. All of these organizations throughout the past have been donating millions of dollars over the years to these nonprofit foundations that funnel money back into the GILEE program. And then on top of that, Georgia State itself, the university, houses and is what is fully funding the actual operation. There were individuals a few months ago who actually went to the GILEE headquarters and did an action and disrupted it. And it's quite literally housed on campus in the Andrew Young International Policy Building, right? So the one of the biggest sponsors of it, who we have to put pressure on, is Georgia State University. And in fact, Georgia State University has awarded Robbie Freeman over the years for this program multiple times, and have praised and used this program to actually attract more donors and more donations. And so I'll yield there and pass it over to Tunde, but I think one of the biggest money sources behind it is the university itself.
Absolutely. The university is a key pressure point because, a lot of the donations, as Musa mentioned, come through that Georgia State University Foundation, right, which it's a tax-exempt nonprofit foundation or organization, right? And so, corporations like Musa mentioned use the Atlanta Police Foundation, or APF, which is, another private organization that funnels corporate money toward these types of policing initiatives to funnel money to the GILEE program. Some people think of APF, or the Atlanta Police Foundation, as kind of like a funding source, but also kind of a public relations arm of the Atlanta Police Department that helps promote, anti-crime hysteria and spread the police perspective of things, right? And most large cities actually have a police foundation, and so basically every big city, and so even though Atlanta ranks in 39th in terms of total population in the U.S., the APF is actually the largest police foundation in the country, largely because of Cop City, as Musha pointed to, but they actually tripled their income in 2021 because they got something like $26 million in contributions. And, the second largest police foundation, which is the New York Police Foundation, brought in just under $8 million. But yeah, as Musa meant, like there are all sorts of large corporations that have a presence here in Atlanta, like Bank of America, Chick-fil-A, Coca-Cola, AT&T, and Waffle House, and Home Depot, and more, that are large donors to the police foundation, which again is behind all sorts of initiatives like Cop City, like Operation Shield, and is a big player in this GILEE program. But a lot of corporations actually choose to donate directly to GILEE through the GSU Foundation, right? So some of those that I mentioned earlier, like UPS and Equifax and Georgia Power, are on the record as giving large sums of money to the Georgia State University Foundation for GILEE. There are also some Zionist nonprofits here in Atlanta, like the Jewish Federation of Greater Atlanta, that give a lot of money for GILEE, right? Like they are making multiple, $100,000 contributions to support the operations of the program. And then it's not just corporations, right? Like the city of Atlanta has its own ways to contribute funding to GILEE. Even the state of Georgia, and at the federal level, right? Like the Department of Justice has a way of contributing, right, to this program. And so I think there are so many different funding sources, but we can use the Georgia State University Foundation and Georgia State in general as a pressure point to fight back against this program.
Yeah, Musa, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just again, it's so hard to even choose what to say sometimes in these interviews because there's so much. But in 2022, GILEE had its 30th anniversary celebration, which was partially sponsored by Mercedes-Benz and Delta at the Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta at a special lounge there. Co-sponsored also by the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies at Georgia State. The honorary host of the event, and this is all from the GILEE website, by the way, was his name is Bernie Marcus, aka the co-founder of Home Depot, and I believe a board member as well. Our current Atlanta mayor, Andre Dickens, the police chief. So these are just some of a few of the people who were all in the room at this celebration of this event. And I think that gives such a glaring example of how this program is really the collusion of capital with public interest. And then on top of that, I think there's a lot of propaganda that gets pushed out in local media because the Cox Foundation, which is a massive media conglomerate, and Cox Corporations, they own roughly, I think the last number I saw was like 94% of all the media in the state of Georgia. And they have a significant chunk of media nationally, but I'm just talking about where I'm from. And so there were dual citizens between the illegitimate state of Israel and the illegitimate state of U.S. who in the October 7th Alaska flood operation were killed, actually. And these people were trained by GILEE. And the GILEE team, right, and essentially, like Tunde said, the Atlanta Police Foundation, as a PR team, rushed to plant stories all across local media, both in print media, digital media, and on local news, mourning for these colonizer soldiers who were trained. And then the whole story angle is, look, they were trained here with us in Georgia and they died over there, And so even at a local level, there is this very, very big push to legitimate the entire operation that is very insidious, and just shows how these police foundations, like Tunde said, work as a PR arm of the police.
Yeah, and throughout that answer, Cop City was mentioned, and I'm sure most people listening to a show like this are familiar with what Cop City is, but for those who might not be fully aware, can you let us know exactly what Cop City is, what Cop Cities are? Because I think there are plans for more of these around the country, if I'm not mistaken, but the main one with the most attention is certainly based just outside of Atlanta, if I'm correct. Can you just talk about what Cop City is, what the state says their purpose is with it, and what local activists understand their purposes to be?
Yeah, I'll start on this one. So the city of Atlanta has leased 381 acres of South River Forest or Waylani Forest to the Atlanta Police Foundation. And, you know, that foundation is working to construct a militarized police training facility that is funded by corporations. It has a price tag of over $100 million. And, you know, basically, you know, while they present Cop City as like a technologically advanced environment for effective training for law enforcement, and, you know, the chief proponents of the facility, like, you know, Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens and Police Foundation officials claim that it will be used to train police better. We know that isn't, the training isn't going to have a meaningful impact for everyday people, right? Like during the George Floyd uprisings, actually in Atlanta, there was our own instance of, you know, high profile police terror with the assassination of Rayshard Brooks, who was a 27-year-old Black restaurant worker here in Southwest Atlanta by police. And the police officer who assassinated him, Garrett Rawl, had recently been involved in, you know, deadly force and de-escalation training, like earlier that year, a few months earlier. And you know, the training that they engage in is not effective in terms of lessening or ending the role of police, you know, in our society and in colonized communities, right? And so we know that additional training or a training center won't help that. But if we look at really the plans for Cop City here in Atlanta, right, it you know, reveals even more, right? It includes like a mock city to practice urban warfare. It has tear gas and explosive testing. There are dozens of shooting ranges. There's a Black Hawk helicopter landing pad, right? Like all of these features kind of show that, you know, this is the type of training that they'd use to deal with like a hostile or an enemy or captive population, right? And so for like we as activists here, as organizers, we understand that like this Cop City here in Atlanta and the ones across the country are going to be used for, to help police prepare to further control, colonize, incarcerate, and terrorize poor, working class, and oppressed people, right? And so that's our understanding, and we've been referring to it as an urban warfare training center because the initial plans are exactly that. And Cop City is actually, in my view, an example of one of the, it's a result of the deadly exchange because the Zionist state built its own Cop City in occupied Palestine, right? That Cop City is officially known as the Urban Warfare Training Center, so they're out in the open with it, right? The Zionist state they don't have to play games with the propaganda as much with that. But you know, the Zionist soldiers who run military drills there call it mini Gaza or little Gaza, because it literally contains a mock Gaza, right? Like they're able to accommodate exercises for an entire brigade of 2,000 soldiers at a single time. You know, there have been U.S. troops and police and forces who have trained there, along with, you know, forces from across, you know, Europe and other parts of the world. But you know, so it's an example of what is to come right here. They're sharing strategies, tools, and tactics, you know, utilized abroad by the Zionist state, by Israel, and those are going to be mirrored here through Cop City, and the Cop Cities that are springing up or being planned and proposed across the country.
Yeah, and you know, I think that part of what we have to understand is the context that how we even got to where we are to really, you know, we have had, at least since around 2013, we have had pretty much consistent uprising, revolts, riots, marches, protests, direct actions. Increasingly, more and more now we have labor getting involved with strikes, walkouts, there's union movements, protests for racial justice, protests for et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Counterinsurgency is working in real time as we're working. And so as all of this unrest is there, our material conditions are also in the fucking toilet, right? Like, wages are deeply exploitative and suppressed by all measures. There's hyper-exploitation. We have mass incarceration. There's a rent and housing crisis. And so the people, we are reacting as organically and naturally possible in response by organizing and uprising. And so in 2020, with the protests subsequent from the murder of George Floyd, we saw massive uprisings. We had over 13,000 people across the country arrested during protests during the summer of 2020. 13,000. That's in 50 states. That's a huge number, and all 50 states at that. And so Cop City was something that they had already been mulling on and having sort of like the back burner in the city of Atlanta. And then 2020 happens, and you have thousands of people hitting the streets and protesting, and police precincts burning and taking place. Then they use this as justification to sort of supercharge the Cop City plans and rush it forward, saying we need this now more than ever. Our police need to be trained more than ever. And in fact, I couldn't, it's so fucking offensive. It's actually like hard to even keep it straight sometimes. They were going to have, part of it is like a Martin Luther King civil rights sort of workshop or something at the training center. I'm sure Tunde can correct me, but they're trying to incorporate quote unquote racial justice into the Cop City. So the reason why I think it's important to understand that Atlanta we have the most attention because we had a forest defender, Tortuguita, who was assassinated here in Atlanta for trying to fight against Cop City. But these Cop Cities, there's over 69 proposed across the country. And I think having that context that it was the response to like our countrywide revolt and uprising, and now we're getting a coordinated national response, right, from both. And I think Tunde mentioned too, Barack Obama called Atlanta a quote unquote model city for policing, and praised this is a police force that has killed ample Black people, that oppresses Black people every day. And so they're literally looking at Atlanta as like a vanguard of counterinsurgency, of suppressing protests, of active repression. So that is how we've gotten to this point now where there's like 61 to 62 protesters, some people who were just hanging up posters around town, literally receiving RICO charges and domestic terrorism charges. This is part of like this national crackdown and really fascist violence and wave against organizers and activists. And as Tunde just reminded me, Cop City was originally called the Institute of Social Justice. And they were probably going to get Tyler Perry to cut the ribbon on there or something, But anyway, I'll yield there because there's so much more I could say, but I don't know, what your thoughts are on that, Breht.
Yeah, well, I certainly have thoughts. One of the thoughts, and I think you were gesturing towards this and really making this argument, which is that this is a concerted and coordinated national and with international dimensions response to largely movements that have been popping off for the last several years, but specifically the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, which really threw this country, into turmoil, and every major city had weeks and months of uprisings. I can't help but note that Atlanta is this famously Black city with this long, sort of cultural epicenter of Black culture, Black resistance going back and through the civil rights movement and past it. And the fact that, yes, cop cities are being built and being proposed all around the country, of course they would have to be, but the fact that Atlanta becomes this focal point I don't think is an accident. And I do think even going back to the funding that we were talking about a few questions back about these corporate interests who, fund this, the Georgia State University Foundation, they probably get nice tax deductions and get to present that as philanthropy. We're supporting the community when in reality they're supporting this focus on policing, the opposite of defunding, more funding for the police, because I think our ruling class knows on some level, especially at the higher up you go, that this is more conscious, that this system is in crisis. This system cannot provide for the vast majority of human beings, that their profits are really centered and are maintained by the status quo, and that we have these two roads we can go down, more or less, which is radical reform or even outright revolution, where we actually address the root problems of this country, which would deeply threaten the interests of the ruling class elite and of these corporations and their profiteering, or we're going to go down the road of maintaining the status quo through violence. The status quo can no longer truly be maintained by ideological mystification and paying off enough people, and there's a labor aristocracy and a middle class which acts as a bulwark against the poor. That whole system is disintegrating. And so they realize that police force, militarized violence, is going to have to be the only other option if they don't want, which they don't, radical reform or revolution. And so whether that's a conscious strategizing of CEOs in these corporations or just a sort of background ambient understanding amongst the ruling class, I think that plays a huge role in this. And yes, the acute moment is the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, and then this is this response to it. But I also think that was one of many tremors for this coming earthquake, that this system as it currently exists is not sustainable. And they're going to sustain it with pure violence. And what better place to look, if that's your goal, than what Israel is doing to the Palestinians? So that was, that just makes sense. And I'm wondering if that resonates with either of you.
I mean, it absolutely resonates. And this is something that the Black Alliance for Peace, Atlanta Citywide Alliance, we've been very clear on this from the beginning. This is why we're so adamant on making connections to the violence of imperialism abroad and domestically. Because I think a lot of people forget or don't realize that domestically, especially colonized populations here within the U.S., we also are victims of imperialist violence, right? And so when the Panthers decades ago were saying what the pigs do, to our brothers in Vietnam, the pigs here do to us, they weren't just trying to make some catchy slogan. They were really providing us with the correct lens to see this shit with. Sorry for cussing a lot. It's a Saturday. We're recorded. I'm relaxing. But, another aspect, too, that I think that connects Cop City, if we take the pigs at their own words, right, they are saying in their own words, Cop City will allow them to expand all of their capabilities. It will allow all of their programs to have more space and more capability. It will allow police departments around the state, around the region, around the country, and around the world, that's their phrasing, to come and train here. And so, one, there's already about half a dozen I think more now, a dozen departments in the state of Georgia who are trained with Israel. There is countless police departments nationally who are trained with Israel. And so what we assume and we can expect based on their own words is that GILEE is part and parcel with Cop City, and this is going to allow them to expand GILEE even more. And like Tunde was saying, there's a quote-unquote little Gaza that the IDF uses. Our Operation Shield here in Atlanta is built from the command and control center that Israel keeps in Jerusalem. When we were protesting in 2016 and 2017, they were using direct Israeli occupation tactics on us, like kettling. We were occupying a lawn and they would not allow food, water, and medicine in. Several of the police who they sent out to repress the protests were wearing these fake Israeli kufiyas that they get and these little pins that they get when they finish the program, actually. So we have I can even personally say direct experience of seeing U.S. Atlanta police trained by Israel being sent directly against protesters all the way back as early as like 2015, 2016. So this is really just like the development of all of those counterinsurgent forces.
Tunde, you have anything to add to that? I really appreciate what y'all shared. I agree. I think the rationale and objective of increased imperialist violence, increased militaristic violence is to maintain the system. And so we see this in many different forms, right? Cop City is just one manifestation, right? Like we've seen, increases in police killings, right? Like it seems like the past few years, like they keep breaking records in terms of how many people that the pigs kill, right? There's an increase in surveillance and I guess mass Black incarceration, right? There's this targeting of activists. I think Musa spoke to the domestic terrorism charges. I think 46 or so Cop City activists face, and then there's the 61 RICO charges. But then going back to like a few years, right? There was the targeting of Black identity extremists by the FBI, right? There is this increase of repression and militarism domestically, but we also see that internationally, like y'all were speaking to, right? Militarism is a central element of U.S. imperialist strategy, right? And so we see these escalating and never-ending military interventions. We also see unconventional warfare in the form of economic warfare, right, with sanctions. And I think what we're seeing is this will continue to escalate unless we press on the vulnerabilities of this state, right? And I think that's where we have to press, right? And that's an essential part of BAP's focus. We're focused on the militaristic manifestations of imperialism, like the imperialism in its military form, and so that's part of this anti-GILEE work. Like, how can we utilize what we have at our disposal, right? How can we build people power to and strategically think about how we can expose these connections and shut down programs like GILEE. But yeah, I was just appreciating what y'all shared earlier.
Sure, yeah. And another thing I was going to add, and maybe you have thoughts on this as well, is we've noticed with the sort of corporate centrist Dems, as well as sort of all the reactionary right of every different stripe, this increasing paranoia and hysteria about campus politics, right? Even the Zionists are targeting students and trying to ruin their lives and their futures who just go out and acknowledge Palestinian humanity. And I think a part of that hysteria from those centers of power and those interests that are interested in maintaining the status quo is that the life that young people have lived through, right? We've lived through the Great Recession. We've lived through the War on Terror. We've lived through Standing Rock and Black Lives Matter. Palestine is now, deeply educating an entire generation of young people about how the dynamics of oppression and how it plays out. And young people are turning against, Israel, which is unthought of, unheard of, even 20 years ago, that this would be this much grassroots momentum against such an important U.S. ally as this outpost in West Asia for their imperialist and colonialist interests. And I think there's a lot of real concern with these figures and these movements that are interested in the status quo or interested in going backwards, that young people, not just because they're young and starry-eyed, but because they've lived through the material conditions deteriorating rapidly. There's been multiracial, sort of coming together in solidarity around things like Palestine and the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of those white kids that in the 60s or 70s would have been safely and securely middle class and therefore might have grown out of their radicalism once they got a home and they got a nice job with a nice pension. That's no longer there, which, is one of the things that the system has sort of relied on, is these pitting of different classes amongst the working class against each other, different races against each other, buying out part of the proletariat and turning them against lower parts of the proletariat. That whole system of control, I think, is falling away as well. And I think one manifestation of that is precisely this hysteria that you'll hear from Bill Maher, as well as from the hardcore fascist right and everybody in between, that there's a real problem with these campus politics, and these young people are so stupid, so naive, et cetera, trying to denigrate them in every single way. And I think underneath that hysteria and that hatred and that disdain is a real sense of insecurity that one way or another, good, bad, or ugly, change is coming. And they're doing everything they can to sort of, cut that off at the knees. I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we are definitely seeing, the campus repression over the course of the past few months. Actually, since kind of October 7th, there have been a number of mobilizations on, various campuses here in the Atlanta area, right? And specifically at Georgia State, right? There have been large marches and rallies talking about GILEE in particular, right? Students understand this issue and are opposed to the program for the most part, right? And we're building with students to, I guess, further strengthen those efforts. But there's been a lot of repression in Atlanta in relation to those protests and general, pro-Palestinian sentiment on campus. And so that's something that we're reckoning with, we're dealing with, right? Because, repression is meant to, I guess, scare folks from wanting to participate in fighting back. And so that's definitely an area for us. We've even seen aspects of, militarized response to these campus protests. Everything from, police bringing out militarized gear as they try to intimidate folks who are taking the streets. I guess that kind of speaks to, just the wide-ranging impacts of militarism, right? They're willing to bring out, things like tear gas to protests. And we've seen tanks at certain protests here in Atlanta. We've seen, the usage. We've heard about skunk gas. So I think that there is that element of, the U.S. police utilizing the weapons, the tools, just the tactics that are used abroad. Really, when you think about tanks, right, you think about the occupations, the coups, and the wars that the empire perpetrates against colonized people around the world, and those same I guess tools are used to terrorize folks right here in the U.S. and to quell our uprisings, right? And so I think it speaks to what is to come. And, obviously we're seeing horrific images coming out of Palestine. And so I think, it's all relative, but I think, like you're saying, right, that it is an attempt to stave off what is inevitable. Yes.
Yeah. And I just wanted to add, I mean, we've also seen repression specifically around GILEE as well. In fact, the only reason we even know as much as we do about GILEE now is after years of independent journalists like Anna Simonton, who did a wonderful report for Mondoweiss a few years ago, and the Atlanta Community Press Collective, who has become one of the best and only independent media sources in the city. They're doing Freedom of Information Act. They're doing FOIA requests on the city of Atlanta in order to get information on GILEE. So even the fact that supposed, public safety professionals are engaged in a program through which we have to literally force the hand to get information about their operation, and we have to literally do FOIA requests. And there's been FOIA requests on GILEE going back just about 20 years. And I remember reading through a recent stack of documents that the Atlanta Community Press Collective got back, and they were I recognized one or two people's names who had signed on to a statement and a letter against GILEE, and now the police were emailing and saying, "Have you seen this letter?" And they're literally surveilling and talking about this through social media surveillance. And this is in their email exchanges. So again, we know a sliver through these FOIA requests that there is repression, at least in the emails being talked about. So we can only imagine what's happening behind closed doors. And then on top of that, you know, we have the 1033 program.
Yes, that's where I was going to go next, because I think Tunde was really, you know, kind of gesturing towards that, this militarization of the police and the programs around it. So yeah, you can definitely go into that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, you look at the Israeli occupying forces and the line between police and military person and civilian, all three of these things are intentionally very blurred, right? I mean, what we're seeing right now is this exact same thing has been underway for several years, but is being crystallized inside of like the 1033 program, GILEE, and these top cities, where U.S. police forces that have now been militarized to a certain extent, the line between military occupying force and quote unquote police officer is certainly blurred when it comes to the 1033 program. And so basically what this is, and the Black Alliance for Peace, we have been demanding an end to the 1033 program immediately. It's basically the U.S. Department of Defense. They administer this program, and it transfers excess military equipment from the U.S. military, all branches of U.S. military, to local U.S. police forces, federal, state, and local. This is the FBI, this is the Atlanta Police, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and everyone in between. So far, the program has sent over $6 billion in military gear to local police departments across the country. And a lot of the really most notable examples of the 1033 program, when people really started to wake up to it and be like, wait a second, you know, what's going on, is Ferguson in 2014, when the first time, at least as it was being live tweeted and shown on air, where we had militarized tanks and armored vehicles and all kinds of and sound cannons, which they've used on us here in Atlanta since 2013. I remember the earliest in Baltimore in response to the uprisings around Freddie Gray, you know, all of the times where we have seen this excessive militarized gear that the police has. Every time we've seen them use, it has been on pretty much uprising Black and Indigenous people. Because if we recall, the same thing took place in Standing Rock. It was simply with a private security firm, right? But the same exact thing.
Yeah. And
so the 1033 program is a federal program that is literally, the whole function is just to militarize the police. Barack Obama championed this program, and then Trump championed this program, and Biden champions the program. There's at no federal level or state level that I'm aware of even any consideration of challenging this law. And at a local level, this essentially intertwines with programs like GILEE or even like SWAT. You know, there's people don't realize there's actually dozens of SWAT raids that are taking place primarily in Black neighborhoods every single night. The numbers, when you look at the number of SWAT raids that are taking place, who also, you know, these are special weapons and tactical units. I believe it's an average of 124 a night SWAT raids taking place. And wow. Of those, the vast majority are Black neighborhoods where these are taking place. Mm-hmm. So this level of militarization and occupation it's I don't want to say it's like unimaginable and be super dramatic, but it is a heightened and new development and level of counterinsurgency by this capitalist state. Mm-hmm. And then one more thing I wanted to, actually, never mind. I'm gonna yield there and see if Tunde wants to add anything.
Yeah, no, that was a great breakdown. I think, you know, as it relates to, you know, with the 1033 program, right? Like, it allows these police departments to acquire these military weapons, this military equipment from the Pentagon at like very discounted, like dramatically discounted prices. So, police departments that are like claiming to need help fighting the war on drugs or something, or like the war on domestic terror or whatever, right? Like they are, particularly encouraged to partake in this program. And, we know that those wars are really created to further control, incarcerate, and colonize foreign working class people, Black and indigenous people, right? So again, the Pentagon's weapons and tactics that they developed for their occupations and coups and wars on Africans and other colonized people around the world are used domestically to terrorize and control people here in the U.S., right? Mm-hmm. Oppress people here in the U.S., right? And so, the 1033 program has really been a primary mechanism for this, increased reliance on the military option to repress people here in the U.S. I think it's something like $7.4 billion of military gear have been transferred to domestic agencies since the 1990s. And so I think when we say it's 6 million or 7.4 million, right, that those are, serious amounts, right? Like that kind of money could be used to pay for healthcare for like 2.5 million kids for a year. It could pay for like 108,000 infrastructure jobs. So this is serious. These are serious resources that are going towards this militarization. And as Musa spoke to, like the SWAT raids, right? Those are facilitated because all of these police departments have access to this type of equipment, right? Like they use grenades, they use tear gas, assault rifles, armored vehicles, and helicopters to terrorize and sometimes kill folks during these SWAT raids. A lot of raids have typically been for like drug possession, and not like active shooter situations. So it's a heightened response. Like it's an unnecessary, you could say, response. Like there have even been SWAT raids that have taken place for like underage drinking and like running a barbershop without a license. And so these SWAT raids are really a weapon against oppressed people here in the U.S. There was actually more recently, like we've mentioned Tortuguita, right, earlier, and how Tortuguita kind of propelled the Stop Cop City movement into some limelight about that like a year ago, mm-hmm. right? Tortuguita was killed during a SWAT raid, right, mm-hmm. In the Atlanta forest, the Weilani forest. Recently, there was a few SWAT raids that were used to arrest protesters here in South Atlanta who have engaged in the Cop City movement, right? And so I think that they're a weapon of the state to suppress protests, but also just to terrorize, poor and oppressed communities, right? And so I think we see the 1033 program as an area that we need to struggle against, a program we need to end immediately. And we understand that the more militarized the police are, the more civilians that they kill, right? And that the militarization of the police, right? We've talked about it as like a function of this imperialist this system, right? And we understand that it was popularly used to crush the Black liberation movement of the 60s and the 70s, right? Like that was one of the first instances that we can point to as showing the usefulness of this strategy, this military option domestically. And so we're seeing kind of new forms of that today. But yeah, that's intimately connected to this GILEE struggle, and we're intent on like making those connections and making sure people are clear on that as we fight to end this program, but more ultimately, right, like fight against imperialism, fight to end imperialism.
Absolutely. Yeah, incredibly well said. And that's the thing. Cop City, the GILEE program, the 1033 program, they are, as both of you have made incredibly clear and with extreme clarity, they are deeply, deeply connected issues. And the militarization of the police's armaments comes with the militarization of their psychology. Police have always been racist. They've always upheld a racist and classist system, especially in this country with their origins, as slave catchers. Police have always been shit. But in an ideal society, or in the idea of like white liberals' minds, cops are supposed to be, and for them they often are, these just like providers of security to serve the community, etc. You give them weapons of war, you give them vehicles of war, you train them with people who are at war against their colonized subjects. Like in the case of Israel, you train with them. They develop a psychology that sees people that they are paid by those people. Their tax dollars are paid to protect them. They then start seeing them as a sort of foreign enemy, and all of this brutality can easily flow from that. I mean, we've had a few years ago, I remember the story of a SWAT team going in. I think it was over some stupid drug shit, throwing a flashbang grenade into a crib with the toddler. Breonna Taylor, right? The police kicked down her door. Wasn't even the right house. Came in firing. I think her boyfriend tried to shoot back. And Breonna Taylor was murdered by these fucking pigs, and not a single one of them, faced any accountability for that whatsoever. I remember horrific images from 2020 of, these ostensibly non-lethal rounds, like rubber bullets, blowing people's, parts of their entire eyes out. These vans disappearing people, pulling up and grabbing protesters, throwing them in, organizers dying under mysterious circumstances. I mean, this is not going to go away. This is all, one process, one thing that needs to be combated with many different arms. And I believe it was Tunde who was saying earlier about, like, look at all the money we spend on this shit. This could go to actually solving the root causes of so much problem, like homelessness and crime, by giving people housing, making sure that money goes to providing health care, social programs, good jobs with good wages, unions for every worker. But guess what? That's not profitable. What is profitable is having low wages. What is profitable is private prisons. What is profitable is the military-industrial complex spending literally trillions and trillions of U.S. tax dollars to, Iraq, Afghanistan. That's almost $7 trillion right there. The money we've given to Ukraine and Israel alone in this latest round of conflicts is enough to solve homelessness in the United States. Hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars going to these proxy wars and these conflicts. Instead of going here. And the average American, not even very politically sophisticated, asks the question all the time, regular people in my life, like, shouldn't we spend this money on our own people? And of course we should, but the joke is, we don't own this system. This is not our system. It is not in our interests. It is in the interests of the profiteers who own this entire society. And there's no profit in making sure people are housed, have health care, have safe streets, have good infrastructure, have action on climate change. It's not profitable to these companies. And so they're going to use the police as this militarized fascist force of violence, specifically on black and indigenous and brown and poor communities, multiracial poor communities, if it comes to that. And that's what they've decided is going to be the future. And I think, people often say that what Israel is doing to Palestine right now is in some sense a testing ground for what's coming to communities around the world. Some communities, like the black community, the indigenous community in the U.S., they've lived under that forever. But I think more and more people are now being they're being proletarianized, they're being pushed down the class ladder, they're not allowed to not able to buy homes, not able to get an education without going into lifelong debt, have no health care. More and more people are being put into, the lower classes, and that means more and more control to keep them at bay. And I think that's precisely what we're seeing, and that's why all of these things need to be connected, as both of you have done brilliantly, and need to be combated. And with that last point in mind, Musa, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted, before, I don't know if we're about to close out or not, but I wanted to just hit on something that you kind of mentioned and I didn't get to earlier,
Sure.
Real briefly, is Atlanta is known as a quote-unquote black city, and it's even called the Black Mecca, or the Black Gay Mecca, the Black Mecca of the South. It's synonymous with blackness, whatever that means nowadays, civil rights, organizing, activism. They use this legacy against us by employing what we call the Black Misleadership class. Shout out to Glenn Ford from Black Agenda Report. The Black Misleadership class, or the Colonial Comprador class. And they have the local politicians in Atlanta who are pushing through Cop City, who champion GILEE, and who actually spoke and honored Robbie Freeman at the 30th anniversary GILEE celebration, Mayor Andre Dickens. We are surrounded and inundated with and dominated by Black faces doing the dealings of white capital. And we have an entire Black misleadership class who has been leading the charge, ushering in Cop City, who have been running cover for and protecting and promoting GILEE and the 1033 program and all of these things. And it's very important to name that, because if you turn on the TV, all you see is Real Housewives of Atlanta. All you see is rappers from Atlanta. All you see is singers like Victoria Monet from Atlanta. And you hear about Atlanta ball players and quote-unquote culture. And T.I. is buying back the block, and Killer Mike won a Grammy. But on the ground, those of us who live here in this city and in this state, our reality is completely 100% different as workers from this Black misleadership class. They are literally twerking and dancing on the dick for daddy's white dollars and pushing through Cop City as if they had a contest to see who could do it the fastest. And even last week, last month on Valentine's Day, we had houses of Stop Cop City and anti-GILEE organizers. Their houses were raided, and it was executed by the Atlanta Police Apex Unit. So that's the Atlanta Police, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, so that's state level, ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, so that's a federal agency, and the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So that means our local, quote-unquote, Black leadership in Atlanta teamed up with the white Republican at the governor national level, state level, and then with the federal state to execute this repression of activists. So there's such a strong claim of it being a Black Mecca, and this is a Black city. Meanwhile, its Black leadership is colluding with state and federal agencies to further incarcerate its organizers. So I just really wanted to point that part out, because you mentioned earlier about it being a Black city, and you're right on the money, because they use that against us, and they will point to civil rights icons and say, well, they never burned a police precinct down. You should be more like them, or things like that. And they use that legacy against us to try to get us all in suits and ties instead of marching in the streets.
Yeah, incredibly well said. And that comprador analysis, I think, is spot on. I mean, Fanon talks about that in The Wretched of the Earth. And if you take seriously, as we do, this idea that Black folks in the U.S. are a colonized, occupied nationality, an oppressed nationality within the U.S. borders, then it absolutely is it's just logical that there's also this comprador class. And you're right, that's the face that is presented to the rest of the country that represents Atlanta, like Killer Mike, T.I. in particular, but yeah, all the other figures you said as well. They are held up as the face of Atlanta, but you're right. There's these class distinctions that are always wrinkled over and completely ignored when such a thing occurs. So I think what you said is really important. Now, as we enter the end of this conversation, I want to give both of you room to say anything else that we might not have covered. I know we didn't exactly get to every single question on the list because the conversation became organic. But any last words, and then also what listeners that are listening that understand what you've been saying and want to assist in any way. Maybe they live around a Cop City, maybe they live in Atlanta, maybe they don't. How they could possibly help or assist Black Alliance for Peace in their work.
Yeah, I'll just add or share that BAP has a Zone of Peace campaign that we're building with key partner organizations throughout the Americas region. And really, we think of the Americas as broader than, Central, South America, or Armenia. The Americas we're referring to as like in Western America, which is, a term that revolutionary forces here have used to assert themselves against colonialism and imperialism by claiming one contiguous landmass stretching from Canada to Chile, right, for all of the historically oppressed people of the region, right? So we're working with formations throughout the Americas to activate really the popular movements in our region in support of the 2014 CLAC, or Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, call to make the Americas region a zone of peace, right? And so for us, right, this campaign is informed by the Black radical peace tradition, which it's a key I guess principle for the Black Alliance for Peace, and the Black radical peace tradition for us says that peace is not the absence of conflict, but rather the achievement by popular struggle and self-defense of a world liberated from the interlocking issues of global conflict, nuclear armament, and proliferation, unjust war, and subversion, really through the defeat of global systems of oppression, including colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. Right. So that is what is informing this campaign, and for us, we're elevating that call for a zone of peace that came out of that CLAC meeting in 2014 in Cuba, and is focused on the structures and interests that generate war and state violence, right? The colonialism, the capitalism, patriarchy, and all forms of imperialism, right? So our fight for a zone of peace is an attempt to expel all of these nefarious forces from the Americas region. And so, that means ending GILEE and all deadly exchange programs, right? Ending the 1033 program, right? Like really addressing settler colonialism and capitalism in meaningful ways, right? And so that's what we're working to build with a number of different partner organizations. If you go to the blackallianceforpeace.com, the website, right, there's a list of the formations that we're building with, everything, organizations stretching from, Molagaf in Haiti to, the Proceso de Comunidades Negras in Colombia, to, ATN in Nicaragua, and so many more, right? There's so many organizations we're building with on this campaign. And so I think it's just relevant to this work, but just because we're talking about how can folks, build with BAP in terms of the fight against, GILEE and all these structures of, imperialism and colonialism. So I wanted to mention that, but then I also want to say that locally in Atlanta, right, informed by like the zone of peace approach, BAP-Atlanta is working with local organizations and student organizations to develop the Demilitarized Atlanta to Palestine Coalition, which has a primary emphasis on ending GILEE, right? That is our first objective and our primary objective at the moment. Nice. Right? And so, we're doing a lot of educational work on the campuses, and we're building out strategies. We have some clear emphases and focus points for right now in terms of initial strategies, but essentially the explicit purpose is to shut down GILEE. We're working with groups like Palestinian Youth Movement, Critical Resistance, Palestinian Feminist Collective, Students for Justice and Palestine chapters on some of the campuses, specifically in Georgia State and Spelman, Morehouse, etc. Well, the AUC, I should say. Projects out. So we're building with a lot of organizations here to develop a really focused and strategic campaign. And folks should really, if you're in Atlanta, you should really look into building with us on that. And also, I guess, building with BAP, right? Like we have our programs and efforts locally that we're building out. And I think just if you want to connect with us, we have a solidarity network made up of non-Black or non-African members, and then we have the Black and African member base that is working to address imperialism in all its forms, and specifically its militaristic forms. So yeah, just want folks to check us out, connect with us on those things.
Beautiful. Yeah, Musa, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, Tunde laid it all out. I was part of the small group with Tunde and a few others. We actually traveled from Atlanta, me and Tunde, from Atlanta to Cuba, Havana, last April 4th, and launched the Zone of Peace campaign. And we're able to elevate the movement to stop Cop City, including information about GILEE, to the Cubans and to some influential activists and organizers in Cuba who expressed their strongest solidarity with us. The first response, they were like, "Why are y'all letting this happen? What do you mean?" Like, what? They couldn't really even fathom something like that. Yeah. They were like, it's a military base in your backyard base? They were shocked, to say the least. And I just would hope all the listeners can offer us the same kind of solidarity our Cuban comrades unwaveringly have. And I also want people to check out, like I said, we live under information warfare and psychological propaganda. And the Cox Foundation, the Cox Corporation media conglomerate, owns the majority of information coming out from this city, this state that I've lived in my whole life, basically. And so I really want people to check out the Atlanta Community Press Collective. They do really phenomenal independent reporting. They are one of our very few groups, collectives doing that work. There's also Mainline, WRFG, a local independent radio station, one of the few 100% non-commercial radio stations left in the Southeast, actually. Check out my podcast, Groundings. I did an episode about Cop City. I've done an episode about GILEE and some other things. But most importantly, join an organization and organize. If you go to isyourlifebetter.net, they have a map of over 69 cop cities, either proposed or already in the works of construction, all across. It's in 50 states except for 2. There's 2 states where there's no proposed cop city. That's in the Midwest. But really understand that what we're trying to do here in Atlanta has international and national implications. And if we're able to stop Cop City here, if we're able to smash GILEE and abolish GILEE here, then that means it can be done elsewhere, and it will, and it should be done elsewhere. Because the police are exchanging with these Zionist pigs all across the country. So yeah, check out BAP if you're interested. If you're an African listening, check out BAP. You can join and become a member and get involved. We have regional structures across the country. And we have local structures and regional structures, actually. So yeah, check out BAP, Black Alliance for Peace. For us specifically, you can go to BAP-Atlanta, BAP-Atlanta on Instagram. And we try to update it pretty frequently. And, I think that's all I have. Peace.
Yeah, wonderful. And I promise I will link to as much of that in the show notes as possible. People can easily find the organization, the Atlanta chapter, etc. I myself have been waiting to get paid so that I can join the Solidarity Network. So I'm going to make that happen this week. Because I just think what the Black Alliance for Peace is doing is really, really incredible and important work. And, I think everybody should support it in whatever capacity they can. And so if you're not of African descent, if you're not Black, you can join the Solidarity Network and continue to support what they're doing. And if you're in an organization, you can, your organization can link up and see how you can work with and help the Black Alliance for Peace in all of their work. So I'll link to as much of that as possible in the show notes. Thank you so much, Tunde. Thank you so much, Musa, for coming on, for the amazing work that both of you do. I really am so honored to be able to platform both of you and to bring more attention to your wonderful, wonderful work. And you always have a home here at RevLeft. That goes without saying.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Appreciate this.